When we think about, bathing in the ancient world, Rome immediately springs to mind. Those huge, grand thermae,
Yeah.
marble everywhere, just pure spectacle.
Right, total monuments to Roman engineering and, frankly, their lifestyle.
But that whole world didn't just evaporate when the empire shifted east to Constantinople, did it?
No, it certainly didn't. And that's really where our deep dive kicks off today, because you have this fascinating question. What happens when that Roman tradition, that love of comfort of the body, runs smack into the really intense spiritual demands of the Byzantine Empire, this deeply Christian world?
Exactly, that collision. That's what we're digging into. We're stepping inside the Balaneion, the Byzantine Bathhouse. And it seems like it was just defined by this inherent conflict.
Absolutely. It's essential for hygiene, obviously, a social necessity. But at the same time, it's seen as this place of, well, spiritual danger. The church is condemning it pretty fiercely, actually.
Yet the state seems to tolerate it, even regulate it.
Precisely. And we've got a really rich set of sources for this. We're looking at architectural descriptions, fiery theological arguments, specific legal codes, even some quite shocking social details.
So the mission today is to really trace that fundamental conflict, right? What the sources call the collision between holiness and heat.
That's the core of it. And what's so striking is how this one space, steamy, enclosed, very deliberately designed architecturally, becomes this central battleground, socially, psychologically, for the Byzantine soul.
It really wasn't just about getting clean then. It seems the structure itself, the social dynamics, the legal framework around it, it all pointed to the bathhouse being this crucial cultural nexus. Maybe because its design almost seemed engineered for moral gray areas.
It's a profound paradox, isn't it? You have this essential public utility, something everyone needs, and yet it's also this prime spot for, well, transgression, for intimacy that wasn't exactly sanctioned.
We need to figure out how that Roman legacy, even as it perhaps faded in grandeur, still provided the perfect stage for all this spiritual tension that really defined Byzantine life. Okay, so let's start right at the foundation. The Roman structure itself. Byzantium inherits this Roman world culturally, architecturally. Did they try to reinvent bathing? Or just take what was there?
Oh, they absolutely inherited and adapted. I mean, the Roman system was incredibly complex from an engineering standpoint. For a long time, there just wasn't a practical alternative.
So the Byzantine baths, whether big or small, they basically kept that same Roman blueprint.
Meticulously.
Yeah.
We're talking about the classic three-part structure. It dictated the whole experience, really.
Right, so you guide us through it. You start cold.
You start in the frigidarium. That's the cold room, often with a big plunge pool. Then you move through the tepidarium, the warm room. This was kind of transitional, preparing you for the heat, but also a major social space.
And then the main event, for our story at least.
Then you hit the Caldarium, or Thermalutarium, the hot room. And that's where things get really interesting sensorially and morally.
And in Constantinople, initially, these could still be enormous, couldn't they? Echoes of Rome's glory.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the baths of Zeuxippus, a spectacular holdover from the Roman era. Huge, incredibly lavish, decorated with marble, mosaics, hundreds of classical statues pilfered from elsewhere. Just a spectacle.
But you're saying we need to distinguish that kind of imperial grandeur from the everyday reality.
Yes, that's key to understanding why bathing culture persisted. You have those massive imperial thermae, huge state-funded operations, but then you have this vast network of smaller, more local places, the Balaneion.
The Balaneion, like the local neighborhood bath.
Pretty much. They were the practical solution, the backbone, really, of continued bathing. They were everywhere. Some public, some private commercial ventures, some even built into wealthy homes, and, maybe surprisingly, even within monastery walls sometimes.
Even in monasteries. That seems counterintuitive given the ascetic focus.
It does, doesn't it? But it shows how deeply ingrained the practice was. The Grand Thermae grabbed the headlines, but the humble Balaneion kept the tradition alive.
Okay, so here's the puzzle. If the church was pushing this ascetic ideal, denial of the flesh, why didn't these massive, obviously luxurious Roman-style baths just vanish? The sources seem to point to something much more mundane.
That's the crucial correction we need to make, I think. Yes, the huge imperial thermae did decline significantly, especially from the 7th and 8th centuries onwards. That's a big historical shift.
But not because the church finally won the argument.
Primarily, no. The sources are pretty clear. The problem was fundamentally financial and infrastructural. It was about logistics.
So budgets and broken pipes, not bishops' edicts.
Essentially, yes. To run something like Zeuxippus, you needed unbelievable amounts of two things: water and fuel. Constantly.
Right, the aqueducts and the heating systems.
Exactly. These enormous complexes, with their sophisticated hypocaust heating, relied entirely on the state having the money and the organization to maintain huge functional aqueduct systems. And you needed a steady, massive supply of wood or charcoal for the furnaces.
Which, during times of war or economic crisis, must have become an absolute nightmare.
It just became unsustainable. When the empire faced serious crises, military threats, plagues, economic downturns, especially from the 7th century on, the state just didn't have the resources, the manpower, or maybe even the political will anymore to keep pouring money into that kind of infrastructure.
Aqueducts could fall into disrepair or get damaged in sieges.
Exactly. And organizing the fuel supply for city-sized furnaces, the logistics just broke down. So it was really an engineering and economic collapse for those grand structures, not a straightforward religious ban.
But hang on, couldn't it be both? I mean, we know emperors like Leo III, the iconoclast, were keen on cracking down on luxury. Wouldn't the economic necessity have provided a very convenient theological excuse? We can't afford it, and it's sinful anyway.
That's a really sharp point, and you're right. Those two forces absolutely could have, and probably did, reinforce each other. The theological argument becomes the perfect justification when the aqueduct is dry. It's much easier to frame it as a moral decision. We're closing this den of sin for your soul's sake when you can't afford to run it anyway.
Makes sense.
However, the key thing is the survival, even the proliferation, of the smaller Balaneion. That tells us the actual practice of bathing was never successfully stamped out.
Yeah.
If it had been purely about theological opposition winning, the whole culture should have buckled under that pressure.
So the desire didn't die, it just shifted. It decentralized into these smaller, more manageable local units. The need for hygiene, for community, for just physical comfort was too strong. An immutable force, as one source puts it.
Exactly. And because it was so socially vital, the state had to find ways to live with the moral risks it presented. Which brings us right to the bath as this essential social hub. It was so much more than just washing.
You really have to picture it. In a city with strict social hierarchies, lots of constraints on public interaction, the bathhouse offered this amazing kind of fluidity.
It was, I suppose, like the Byzantine equivalent of a coffee shop, a gym, a community center, maybe even a bit of a political forum, all wrapped up in one very steamy package.
A place to meet, network, relax.
Definitely. Socializing, doing business deals, hearing news, maybe even having a bite to eat. People from all walks of life, senators, merchants, artisans, they'd spend a good chunk of their day there.
And this brings up a really critical point, especially thinking about Byzantine society. The bathhouse was a rare public space for women.
This is so important and often gets overlooked. Byzantine society was heavily patriarchal. Public space was overwhelmingly male. Women were typically expected to stay within the gymnasium, the women's quarters, or very close to home.
But the bathhouse, even with segregation,
Even with strict rules about separate times or facilities, it offered one of the few legitimate places for women to gather publicly, outside the direct control of the family.
a space for women to connect, share news, maybe even discuss things husbands wouldn't hear. You can see why the moral watchdogs were getting nervous.
Oh, their anxiety was directly proportional to the bath's popularity. It appealed to everyone, sometimes alarmingly so from their perspective. We know from sources that even famous high-profile places like Zeuxippus drew crowds from across the social spectrum,
Including people who, theoretically, should have been avoiding such places.
including monks and clergy members, yes. Even though their own superiors were denouncing the baths as dens of impious behavior, they were still drawn there.
That disconnect is fascinating. Religious figures feeling the pull towards a place their own doctrine condemned.
It perfectly highlights the sheer power of the bathhouse, its social gravity, its physical necessity. The ideological war was definitely being fought, but everyday life, the need to be clean and connected, demanded a visit. And that creates the core tension we're exploring.
Okay, let's move from the structure and the social need into the actual experience, into the heat part of our theme. The sources really paint the Caldarium, the hot room, as this incredibly charged, almost liminal space, a dark, candlelit visual world, as one description puts it.
Yes, and the argument here is crucial. The necessary architecture, the things you had to do to make a hot room function, didn't just contain the heat. They actively created an environment that enabled, maybe even encouraged, transgression.
The physical requirements inadvertently set the stage for moral ambiguity.
That's the core insight. To really get this, we need to break down the mechanics of that hot room. What did it feel like? What did it look like?
Let's start with the heating system itself. the hypocaust. For someone listening who hasn't experienced a Roman-style bath, how did that work, and what did it do to you physically?
Right, the Hypocaust, literally fire from below, was the engineering genius behind it. Underneath the marble floor of the Caldarium, they built a raised floor supported by lots of little pillars called pilae.
Creating a space underneath.
Exactly. Hot air and smoke from huge furnaces nearby were funneled into this space, heating the floor from below.
Yeah.
Then, that hot air was often channeled up through terracotta pipes, tubuli, built right into the walls.
So the heat wasn't just coming from one source, it was all around you, radiating up from the floor, out from the walls.
Precisely. An intense enveloping heat thermos, often quite dry heat initially, but incredibly pervasive. And this immediately forces a kind of physical vulnerability and proximity. You just can't maintain social distance or formality when you're sweating like that. Clothes come off, barriers drop.
The heat itself starts breaking down psychological defenses.
You could argue that, yes. It forces an intense focus on the body, on physical sensation. And then, on top of the heat, you add the steam, the great obscurer.
Right, because they throw water onto the hot surfaces.
Yes, or have hot water pools. In the hottest rooms, the humidity could approach 100%. Combined with the heat, this creates a thick, dense, often milky white fog or steam, and that instantly messes with your vision.
Everything gets blurry, indistinct. Hard to make out faces or details across the room.
Your visual field shrinks dramatically. Edges soften. Identities become harder to discern. Anonymity starts to creep in.
And this lack of clear sight was made worse by the architecture needed to keep the room hot in the first place. You couldn't exactly have big picture windows.
Absolutely not. Keeping that heat in was everything. If you want a room at, say, 120 degrees Fahrenheit or even higher, large windows are a disaster thermally. And glass itself was complex and expensive.
So archaeological evidence confirms this. Small windows.
Yes, studies of bath sites, places like Ostia, or designs for bishops' private baths, even they consistently show minimal external windows in the heated sections. Just small, narrow slits, sometimes called loophole windows, barely letting in any natural light.
Which means for lighting, you're relying almost entirely on artificial sources inside the room.
And those sources would be low-intensity, flickering things. Smoky oil lamps, maybe small candles placed in niches. This creates the defining atmosphere. It's fundamentally dark, punctuated by these small moving points of light, lots of deep shadow, sharp contrasts, constant, almost unsettling visual movement.
Okay, so you've got this intense heat, this thick, vision-blocking steam, and this minimal flickering light. It sounds like it creates a very specific, almost intentional look or aesthetic. And the sources connect this to a key Byzantine concept, marmorigma.
Yes, marmorigma. It essentially means a shimmering or glittering effect. It was actually a highly valued aesthetic in Byzantine art, especially mosaics. Think of how light hits gold tesserae and makes the image seem alive, dynamic, almost otherworldly.
But in the bathhouse, it's achieved differently, through the materials used.
Exactly. It's a kind of profane, sensual version of marmorigma, achieved through the lavish use of polished marble on the floors and walls. Marble was chosen partly for luxury, but also because it reflects light.
Ah, so the polished surfaces bounce the lamplight around.
But crucially, those surfaces are wet, and the light sources are low, unstable, flickering. So the reflection isn't clear and static. It's dynamic, unstable, constantly shifting and shimmering. Light dances off the wet marble, off wet bodies, through the steam.
So the overall effect is you're in this physically intense environment, heat pressing in, but visually everything is elusive, shimmering, indistinct.
That's it precisely. The very things needed for the bath to function, heat retention, steam, polished surfaces, inadvertently created this environment that compromised clear vision. Your body is completely exposed, you're naked, which is necessary for washing.
Right.
But your specific identity, your actions, they're partially concealed by the fog, by the deep shadows, by this dazzling, confusing shimmer.
It's like the environment forced you into this heightened state of physical awareness, the heat, the sweat, the closeness to others, while simultaneously cloaking you in a kind of psychological anonymity, a shimmering disguise.
It aestheticized the whole experience, didn't it? It turned the simple act of washing into something potentially much more charged, sensual, even spectacular. It created what the outline calls that dark aesthetic.
So, just to summarize that, intense heat lowers resistance. Dense fog provides anonymity. Low, flickering, reflected light makes it all visually confusing but aesthetically charged. For people living in a society that was often very public and hierarchical outside the home, the Bathhouse offered one of the few places where you could almost disappear into the senses.
And that structural ambiguity born from physical necessity is exactly what sets the stage for the moral conflicts to come.
Okay, so if the architecture itself created this, let's say, morally ambiguous space, how did the church fight back? We need to pivot now to the holiness side of this equation. The church clearly knew about the bath's seductive power, and they waged a pretty relentless ideological war against them.
They absolutely did. And it wasn't just a simple case of hating pleasure. It went deeper, to the core of what constituted purity and sanctification in Christian thought.
How so? What was the theological conflict?
Well, for the theologians, water and cleansing found their highest, holiest purpose in the sacrament of baptism. The font wasn't just about washing, it delivered spiritual purity. It cleansed you of sin, offered rebirth.
Okay, so baptism is holy water, spiritual cleansing.
Right. And contrasted with that, the public bath pool represented something else entirely, a kind of hedonistic sensual cleansing. It was focused on the body, on physical comfort, on worldly sensations.
Which the church viewed with deep suspicion.
Deep suspicion. They were in a tricky spot, of course. They had to concede that basic hygiene was necessary for health. You couldn't just tell people never to wash. But they framed the nudity required for bathing as, at best, an unfortunate necessity.
And at worst,
At worst, a prime opportunity, a direct invitation for stirring sinful desires. The body itself was often seen as the vessel of sin, the source of temptation. So an institution like the Bathhouse, which centered on the body, on its care, its display, its sensations, well, it looked like a spiritual trap.
and this criticism wasn't just about the nudity, was it? It extended to the whole culture of luxury surrounding the baths, that Roman inheritance of opulence. This is where figures like John Chrysostom really let loose.
Oh, Chrysostom was probably the most vocal and harshest critic. He saw womanly excess in general as a major spiritual problem, and the baths were exhibit A for him. He hammered away at the waste, the vanity, the misallocation of resources they represented.
And he wasn't afraid to name names, apparently. He called out bishops.
He spared no one. He fiercely condemned anyone, especially wealthy individuals or church leaders, who spent fortunes building extravagant bath facilities. He had that incredible line you quoted it earlier, railing against bishops wasting money on things like disreputable baths hidden from sight for effeminate men.
Wow. Disreputable, hidden from sight, effeminate. That's packing a lot into one condemnation. It links the luxury directly to secrecy, moral corruption, and even a kind of perceived gender deviance.
It's a powerful critique on multiple levels. For Chrysostom, focusing obsessively on your physical appearance, spending lavishly on bodily comfort, was pure idle vanity. It was fixating on the temporary corruptible flesh instead of the eternal soul.
And there was a social justice angle, too.
Absolutely. He argued that every bit of gold spent on polishing marble for a bathhouse, every log burned to heat its water, was money and resources being diverted from the poor, from charity, from the church's true mission. So building a fancy bath wasn't just potentially leading individuals into sin, it was a systemic sin against Christian charity. It showed a fundamentally disordered soul and a disordered society.
So for the average Byzantine Christian just wanting to get clean but also be pious, this must have created a constant nagging tension. But for the real hardliners, the ascetics, the monks, the holy men and women, the position was much simpler, wasn't it?
For the true ascetic ideal, which was hugely influential and celebrated in Byzantium, there was absolutely no room for compromise. The spiritual life was understood as a constant battle against carnal desires, against the logismoi, those tempting thoughts and impulses. And winning that battle required radical self-denial.
Which meant rejecting anything associated with physical comfort or pleasure.
Exactly. Fasting, wearing uncomfortable clothing like hair shirts, sleeping on the ground, constant prayer, and crucially, complete abstinence from baths. The heat, the comfort, the focus on the body, these were seen as inherently dangerous, weakening the spirit's defenses, making the soul vulnerable to demonic influence.
And the stories of the saints really emphasize this.
Oh, the hagiographies are full of it. They celebrate extreme self-denial as the ultimate sign of holiness. You mentioned the pious Olympias earlier. Wealthy, devout woman. The sources say she would only agree to bathe if she was desperately ill, on death's door, basically. And even then, she insisted on keeping her robe on throughout the process.
Just the act of immersing herself in warm water was seen as a major concession, a potential spiritual risk.
It sets up the bathhouse as the symbolic antithesis of the ascetic life. It's the embodiment of everything the holy person is supposed to reject.
But given how strong this rhetoric was, how central asceticism was to Byzantine spirituality, why were monks and clergy still showing up at places like Zeuxippus? It seems like the ideological campaign, however fierce, didn't actually stop people from bathing.
No, it couldn't. Because the spiritual ideal, however powerful, kept crashing against the rocks of physical reality. The simple need for hygiene in crowded cities, the deep-seated social importance of the bathhouse, the undeniable physical pleasure of warmth and cleanliness, these were incredibly powerful counterforces.
The fact that figures like Chrysostom and later patriarchs had to keep condemning the baths century after century, that proves the practice never went away.
Exactly. The constant need for condemnation is the best evidence for the persistence of the behavior. The church's campaign didn't succeed in eradicating bathing.
But what it did succeed in doing was layering this heavy blanket of spiritual anxiety and guilt over a fundamentally necessary and probably quite enjoyable daily activity.
That's precisely it. The bathhouse wasn't destroyed, but it was transformed. It became a contested space, a spiritual battleground enacted in daily life. Every time someone stepped into that warm room, they were potentially stepping into a moral dilemma. Enjoying the heat too much, admiring your reflection in the wet marble, even just relaxing, all potentially sinful. It turned washing into an act requiring constant vigilance and self-scrutiny.
Okay, so the church is waging this ideological war, trying to police the soul. But the state, the emperors, they seem to have taken a more pragmatic approach. They recognized the heat, the inherent dangers in that steamy environment, and decided they needed to manage it through law.
Yes, the imperial state's role was much more about control and management than outright prohibition. They could ban baths that were too necessary, too popular, but they absolutely recognized that the very architecture of the Caldarium, combined with the social dynamics, created real risks for public order and morality.
So they legislated. And this is where Justinian's laws, the novellae, become really important.
They are crucial. Just to remind everyone, Justinian's massive legal project, the Corpus Juris Civilis, aimed to codify centuries of Roman law. The novellae were the new laws issued afterwards, dealing with contemporary problems in the 6th century.
And the fact that regulating bathhouses made it into these fundamental legal reforms tells us something.
It tells us it wasn't a minor issue. It was seen as a significant, widespread problem needing top-level imperial intervention. The state saw the bathhouse as a potential source of social instability that required legal guardrails.
What was their primary tool for control? What did the laws focus on first?
The biggest focus initially was on enforcing strict gender segregation. This seems to have been a major preoccupation.
Why such a strong focus on keeping men and women separate?
Well, from the state's perspective, particularly Justinian's, the public bathhouse posed a direct threat to patriarchal authority and the perceived sanctity of the family unit. The unsupervised mingling of sexes in such an intimate setting was seen as inherently dangerous.
So, how did they enforce this? Paying people.
Yes, bath attendants were specifically paid to enforce the rules. This usually meant either completely separate facilities for men and women within a complex, or, more commonly, rigidly enforced separate bathing times, often women in the morning, men in the afternoon.
And Justinian's laws explicitly linked bathing with other potentially risky social activities.
They did. The novellae interestingly grouped public dining and public bathing together, calling them equally dangerous in terms of threatening public morality and marital fidelity.
The goal being to prevent wives, especially high-status ones whose reputation mattered politically, from having any unsupervised contact with men outside the family.
That seems to be the core concern driving the segregation laws. Strengthening the husband's control, preventing opportunities for adultery or even just the appearance of impropriety. The level of detail suggests this was a real recurring anxiety for the elite.
Okay, that makes sense for managing interactions between men and women, but here's where it gets really interesting. The law didn't stop there. It also tried to regulate intimacy between men.
This is a critical piece of evidence. Imperial law specifically addressed the potential for inappropriate behavior while both men are naked within the all-male environment of the bath. The state felt the need to legislate against certain kinds of closeness between men.
Trying to discourage any close bond and connection, as one law put it.
Exactly. Which tells us that such bonds and connections were in fact forming in the baths, and the authorities were worried about where they might lead.
And the laws get incredibly specific about what was forbidden, what kinds of physical acts were targeted.
The details are quite startling. One law specifically prohibited men from having their limbs broken while lying naked in the bath.
Limbs broken, that sounds incredibly violent. But in context, it must mean something else, like massage.
That's almost certainly the correct interpretation. Vigorous massage involving stretching, joint manipulation was a standard part of Roman bathing culture, often done by skilled attendants. But you can imagine how, in the dimly lit, steamy intimacy of the Caldarium, performed on a naked body.
The line between therapeutic touch and something more erotic could blur very easily, or the massage itself could be a pretext.
Precisely. The fact that the emperor had to issue a specific law against this particular act strongly suggests it was happening, it was known, and it was considered problematic enough to require legal prohibition.
It points directly to the bathhouse functioning as this alternative social space where different kinds of male intimacy could occur.
It really does. And the prohibitions went even further. Laws also forbade bathing with certain close male relatives, your own father or your brother-in-law, and even, intriguingly, with your rabbi.
Why ban bathing with your father or brother-in-law? That seems odd
Unless the environment itself, the enforced nudity and intimacy was seen as inherently risky, capable of generating inappropriate desires, eros, even within family structures. It suggests a deep anxiety about the power of that setting to override normal social boundaries.
And the mention of the rabbi.
That might hint at anxieties about interactions with specific minority groups, perhaps Jewish communities, whose own bathing practices might have been different or perceived as less controlled. Or it could just be listing figures of authority where excessive intimacy was deemed inappropriate.
Regardless, the sheer existence of these laws banning specific types of massage, banning bathing with close male relatives, is powerful evidence. It confirms the bathhouse was recognized by the state itself as a kind of queer space, a place where non-marital, non-procreative desires between men were known to be explored and expressed.
The heat of the Caldarium wasn't just a physical property, it was a legal liability. The state felt compelled to intervene and try to cool things down, legally speaking, even targeting things like massage techniques.
And this whole conflict, the church condemning, the state regulating, the people keep bathing, it just continued for centuries, didn't it?
Right up into the late Byzantine period. That attempt by Patriarch Athanasius and Bathic in 1307 is just astonishing.
Remind us what he tried to do.
He formally asked the emperor to shut down all baths and taverns Monday morning right through to Saturday morning, basically 6 days a week.
That's extreme. What was the goal?
It seems like an act of sheer desperation. Eliminate the main social and physical alternatives, force people back into the churches, presumably by making life outside them unbearably boring and uncomfortable.
1,000 years after Constantine converted the empire, the bathhouse was still seen as the church's primary rival for the people's time and attention. That tells you everything about its enduring power. So, we arrive at this concept the sources use: erotic spirituality, which feels like the perfect phrase for this collision point we've been wrapping out. This is where the physical sensuality, enabled by the steam and shadows, crashes right into the spiritual rules, leading to some very real, very high-stakes consequences.
Absolutely. You take that mandatory nudity, add the disorienting effect of intense heat, cloak it all in low light and steam-induced anonymity. The bathhouse becomes almost purpose-built for secret encounters, for illicit activity.
It offered a unique kind of privacy in public.
Exactly. A temporary escape from the normal social surveillance. It was different from a brothel, which was explicitly transactional, or a tavern, which was maybe rowdy but more open. The bath offered intimacy and obscurity.
And the sources suggest this wasn't just about harmless flirting. There was a darker side. This is where we have to talk about the finds at the Ashkelon baths.
Yes, the archaeological evidence provides some truly chilling proof of the kind of desperation and darkness that could center on these places. At Ashkelon, excavations of the bathhouse sewer system uncovered a significant number of skeletal remains of newborn infants.
Newborns found in the sewers of the bathhouse. That is incredibly grim. What did the analysis show?
Analysis indicated they were predominantly male infants, and they appeared to have been killed shortly after birth and then disposed of via the bath's drainage system.
So the bathhouse sewer becomes the disposal site for infanticide. Does this directly imply the illicit acts leading to these unwanted pregnancies happened in the baths?
It strongly links the facility to the entire cycle of hidden vice. Secret affairs, unwanted pregnancies occurring somewhere in the city, followed by secret births, infanticide, and then using the bathhouse, this central, constantly flowing water system, as a means of disposal. It might not mean the birth happened in the steam room, but it positions the bathhouse as the nexus, the endpoint, for the most desperate consequences of illicit sexuality and social pressure at the heart of the city. It connects the pleasure potentially found there with its most tragic hidden outcomes.
A stark reminder of the human cost behind the moral debates. And alongside this darkness, we have the confirmation, through the legal codes we discussed, of the bathhouse functioning as this queered space. Let's revisit that idea one more time.
Right. In a society where male interactions were usually quite formal based on rank, family, profession, the bathhouse offered something unique. It was a public place where men's bodies were routinely displayed, naked, stripped of the usual markers of status, potentially equalized by the heat and steam.
Creating a different kind of social geography.
Exactly. It allowed for different kinds of negotiations of status, intimacy, desire, happening outside the normal channels of civic life or the family home.
The shared physical vulnerability, the enforced proximity in the heat, potentially fostering connections that went beyond simple hygiene or social chat.
Connections the church certainly condemned as sinful eros, and which, as we saw with Justinian's laws, the state felt it absolutely had to manage and suppress. The banning of specific types of massage, the prohibition on bathing with certain relatives, these aren't abstract moral pronouncements. They are reactions to observable, persistent behaviors.
The state's attempts to police male intimacy provide undeniable proof that such intimacy was a recognized feature of the bathhouse environment.
It confirms the bathhouse was a space where non-normative desires were explored, perhaps negotiated, perhaps fulfilled, requiring active state intervention.
So we have this incredible duality. The bathhouse is necessary for health, for community, it's a state-tolerated utility, yet it's also this known center of vice, luxury, transgression, secrecy, even death. How did Byzantines themselves make sense of this? The sources offer a striking metaphor, don't they, from a Gnostic text.
It's a beautiful and incredibly apt quote, even though it comes from a Gnostic hymn which was outside mainstream orthodoxy. It perfectly captures the bathhouse's paradoxical nature. The line goes, "I am she whom one honors and disdains. I am the saint and the prostitute."
Wow. That really nails it, doesn't it? The bathhouse is both saint and prostitute.
It's the perfect summary. It was honored the saintly aspect, mandated by hygiene, provided by the state or community, a necessary part of social life. But it was also disdained the prostitute aspect, a known center for luxury, for physical temptation, for sexual sin, for hidden transgressions. The heat, the steam, the marble, the bodies, it forced a confrontation with the physical, the carnal.
And maybe this inherent contradiction wasn't just a problem to be solved, but actually served a kind of purpose within the Byzantine worldview, a necessary stage for playing out the drama of salvation.
That's a profound way to put it. You could argue the bathhouse provided the essential vice against which Christian virtue could define itself, could test itself. The whole ascetic ideal relied on struggle, on overcoming temptation.
And where better to find temptation readily available?
Exactly. The Caldarium, with its unique blend of required nudity, intense heat, luxurious setting, and obscuring steam and shadows, was the perfect crucible. It generated the very heat, the temptation, that was needed to make the pursuit of holiness meaningful. Virtue requires the possibility of sin to prove itself.
So, in a very strange, paradoxical way, the architectural limitations of the bathhouse, the things that made it dark and steamy, were fundamental not just to its function, but to the psychological and spiritual landscape of the entire empire. That shimmering, shadowy hot room was the crucible where the Byzantine soul was constantly tested. #tag outro.
So when you pull it all together, the Byzantine bathhouse really does emerge as this incredible microcosm of the entire civilization. You see this constant tension, this negotiation between that powerful, sensual Roman heritage and the intense, demanding spiritual framework of Eastern Christianity.
And the architecture itself wasn't neutral. The Caldarium's design, the low light, the thick steam, the enveloping heat wasn't just about keeping warm. It actively created the conditions for moral ambiguity. It fostered the very risks, infidelity, illicit intimacy, hidden acts that Justinian's laws tried so hard to contain.
And despite centuries of condemnation from powerful voices like Chrysostom, the sheer social necessity, the desire for cleanliness, warmth, and community just proved too strong. Bathing culture survived the fall of the Grand Thermae. It adapted, it persisted in the Balaneion. It outlasted ideological attacks and financial constraints.
Ultimately, you get this powerful image. The flickering lamplight glinting off the wet marble, reflecting in the steamy air. It really does feel like a symbol for the Byzantine soul itself, caught in that shimmering, uncertain space between the clear light of piety and the seductive, obscuring shadows of earthly desire. The bathhouse was maybe the necessary sin of a deeply devout empire.
Which leaves us with a question for you to think about. The Byzantines had this one specific, ubiquitous place, the bathhouse, that was simultaneously an essential public service, vital for health and society, and a legally policed zone of moral hazard and sexual risk. If our modern society had a single equivalent space today, a place maybe you have to go for practical reasons, but which carries that same recognized level of moral ambiguity and social risk. What would that space look like? And how would we today try to regulate the behavior within it?